Hey everybody. Uh, this is a reading of. This is actually the last chapter of the book that I haven't finished reading yet. I read the conclusion before I read the rest of the chapters. Because I'm impatient. Uh, but this is the last. This is the chapter. A chapter from The Twilight of World Trotskyism by John E. Kelly. This is published in 2023. The chapter that I'm reading is titled Explaining the Marginality of World Trotskyism. And I'm going to read the sections of this before I read the piece. The first section, I'll just say, reforms are no longer possible. The choice is, quote, socialism or barbarism, end quote. Party and electoral programs, we demand everything. Parliamentary elections decide nothing. Failure to grasp the relationship between class struggle and class consciousness. The conflation of protest, rebellion, and revolution. Quote, if only there had been a mass revolutionary party, end quote. Lamentation replaces analysis. Let's build a new mass anti-capitalist workers' party, exclamation point. The specters of Lenin and Stalin are the unattractiveness of Bolshevism, orthodox and radical Trotskyism, ideological certitude, electoral delusion, and millenarian fantasy. Alright. So, let's see. I won't actually be able to get to the page I want to go to. Nope. Come on. There we are. Alright, here we go. The previous two chapters established that after 90 years of existence and prolific activity, World Trotskyism remains a politically marginal force comprising over 300 tiny organizations in 69 countries, divided into competing varieties of Trotskyism and spread between no less than 32 Fourth Internationals. The collapse of the Soviet Union clearly accelerated the ongoing decline of the world communist movement, but to the dismay of many communists, it also contributed to the disintegration and decline, not the advance of their own movement. And whilst the strikes and protests of the 1970s clearly facilitated Trotskyist growth in many countries, the multiple waves of protest and uprisings over the past 30 years have done nothing to restore the fortunes of the Trotskyist movement. A more fruitful line of inquiry into the weakness and failings of World Trotskyism centers on the role of doctrine and its relevance or otherwise to contemporary politics. Powerful, sometimes rigid attachment to the core elements of doctrine generates the most characteristic features and failings of Trotskyist policies and political thinking, the alleged impossibility of reforms, the crude reduction of world politics to a binary choice between, quote, socialism and barbarism, end quote, the insistence that every significant social, political, and economic problem can be solved only under socialism, the dismal dismissal of parliamentary democracy in politics as an irrelevance, the desperate illusion that every new protest, strike, or insurgency could be the harbinger of an uprising in revolutionary class consciousness, end of a revolutionary struggle for power, and the continued inability to acknowledge and understand the persistence and pervasive unpopularity of Trotskyist ideas. First section. Reforms are no longer possible. The choice is, quote, socialism or barbarism. In order to become an effective mobilizing agent, a social movement or political party must offer potential supporters two core elements in its dominant narrative: a sense of anger about irrelevant and salient injustice or injustices, and a sense of hope that they can be remedied. Trotskyist publications are undoubtedly strong on the identification of injustices. To read any Trotskyist publication, anywhere in the world, is to enter a realm of almost pure negativity with stories of income inequality, racism, sexual violence, climate change, state violence, famine, civil war, authoritarian regimes, and much more besides. Yet the relentless diet of global horror is often accompanied by the hopeless refrain that, quote, reformism has failed, end quote, and only full-scale revolution can address the myriad of injustices. British Socialist Workers' Party leader Chris Harman's survey of the prospects for revolution in the 21st century dismissed the period of social democratic reforms in the previous century. Quote, this era is long past, end quote, Harman, 2007. In its World Perspectives document issued in 2019, the Committee for a Workers' International, CWI, declared that, quote, rotting capitalism can offer no way out for the masses of the world, end quote. CWI 2019. The other fragment of the old CWI, Ted Grant's International Marxist Tendency, IMT, is equally forthright in the, quote, About Us, end quote, section of its website. Quote, capitalism has reached a dead end, end quote. International Marxist Tendency. Or as Grant's disciple Alan Woods wrote many years previously, quote, the progressive role of capitalism is now completely exhausted, end quote. Alan Woods, 1999. In other sections of International Trotskyism, the same mantra can be found. The Argentinian-based Liga Internacional Socialista recently declared that, quote, capitalism does not work, end quote, and that, quote, the liberal parliamentary welfare state is no longer valid even in the West, end quote. LIS 2020, and see also FTCI 2021, LITCI 2020, and Anti-Capitalist Resistance leaders Faulkner et al. 2021. The futility of campaigning for reforms is often reinforced with the simplistic and groundless claim that the world faces a simple apocalyptic choice, quote, socialism or barbarism, end quote. The slogan appears to have been coined by Karl Kautsky, but is often attributed to Rosa Luxemburg, whose deployment of the slogan socialism or barbarism during World War I undoubtedly resonated with many participants in the murderous battles then being fought out in Belgium and France. The same slogan may well have been equally appealing to many of those caught up in the Nazi Holocaust and to those suffering under Nazi occupation. Yet contemporary Trotskyists seem to imagine that the pathways for the several hundred countries that comprise the world economy can all be condensed into a simple binary choice. For Alan Woods, leading light in the International Marxist Tendency, Sorry, I lost my place. For Alan Woods, leading light in the International Marxist Tendency, quote, the choice before the human race is socialism or barbarism, end quote. According to Anti-Capitalist Resistance, quote, in the interwar period, the world faced a choice between revolution and barbarism. Today, the world faces a similar choice between revolution and extinction, end quote. Faulkner et al., 2021. The two leading French internationals, the Fourth International Lambertists and the 2016 Breakaway CORQI, both adhere to the same view. Quote, the choice set out in the past by Rosa Luxemburg, quote, socialism or barbarism, end quote, is of burning relevance today, end quote. See CORQI 2017, Para 9, and Fourth International Lambertist 2016. And from Argentina, LITCI's 2020 May Day statement declared, quote, the current crisis more urgently poses the central dilemma of all humanity, socialism or barbarism, end quote. The idea that the reformist era is at an end and that world politics is reduced to a simple binary choice, socialism or barbarism, is conceptually naive and empirically flawed. Ralph Miliband pointed out many years ago that to collapse working-class politics into the binary choice of reformist socialism versus revolutionary socialism or constitutional versus insurrectionary roads to socialism in his preferred terminology omits an even more important third strand, that of, quote, social reform, end quote, the search for improvements in the quality of life within the parameters of capitalism. Quote, social reform, end quote, is neither a minor nor anachronistic political current, but is widespread among the world's trade unions and increasingly dominant within European and other social democratic, radical left and green parties. Judged by their manifestos and policies over many years, the British Labour Party and the Swedish and German Social Democrats, to just take three examples, are no longer reformist socialist parties but have gradually evolved into parties of social reform. Related to this point is the fact that there are, quote, varieties of capitalism, end quote, with substantially different welfare regimes, labor market policies, and patterns of income distribution. See Hall and Trotskyism, 2001. See also Beramendi et al., 2015. Even if one accepts that there is a near ubiquitous trend towards income inequality, it is still the case that these long-standing institutional differences make a significant material difference to the lives of working people. See Baccaro and Howe, 2017. As for the, quote, end of the reformist era, end quote, this claim simply does not square with an abundance of evidence, stretching from social and employment law through equalities legislation to the introduction of multi-party parliamentary democracies. Following extensive trade union campaigning, the European Union introduced a raft of workers' rights directives from the 1980s, covering issues such as paid holidays, working time, paid parental and maternity leave, and equal rights for part-time and temporary workers. Minimum wage legislation was introduced in the UK in 1998, in line with many other countries across the world, and again following a campaign by trade unions and anti-poverty groups. Anti-discrimination laws have been enacted across many parts of Europe, North America, and Latin America during the past 50 years in response to the social movements of women and other oppressed groups, and a growing number of countries have recently legalized same-sex marriage, beginning with the Netherlands in 2001, and now including most of Western Europe as well as Australia, South Africa, and the USA, and in Latin America, Argentina, Colombia, and Ecuador. Abortion rights have also made progress across the world, despite regression in parts of the United States, with recent legislative improvements in Argentina 2020 and Ireland 2018 following prolonged campaigns by civil rights and other groups. The passage of such progressive legislation does require a functioning legal and assumes a multi-party democracy, and it's striking that the past 50 years have witnessed a widespread collapse of both military dictatorships and one-party authoritarian states in what's sometimes known as the, quote, third wave, end quote, of democratization. Latin America was notorious for being governed by brutal military regimes, and it has been heartening to chart the collapse of some of the most notorious tyrannies. Argentina in 1983, Bolivia in 1982, Brazil 1985, and Chile 1989. Equally dramatic has been the collapse of the one-party, quote, socialist, end quote, states of Russia and Eastern Europe, and the disintegration of dozens of the one-party states that corrupted African politics, and their replacement by multi-party democracies. According to Hagopian, quote, in Latin America, there were only 3 democracies in 1978. Today, 2007, but there are but 2 authoritarian regimes, Cuba and Haiti, ... In sub-Saharan Africa, only Botswana, Senegal, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Mauritius held regular elections before 1990. And by 1998, only 4 countries have not held some sort of competitive contest during the 1990s, end quote. Hagopian, 2007. There are three classic objections to this kind of evidence. First, any reforms are inherently limited to the requirements of the capitalist system. Alright, I'm going to try to finish reading this because my battery's up there. And their implementation will always prove problematic. Second, reforms can always be rescinded by reactionary governments. Third, the most impressive reforms have been achieved through popular struggles. Any legislative reform has to survive parliamentary challenges from rival political parties, employer groups, and potentially the judiciary, and therefore it invariably ends up as a compromise, not unlike the negotiated agreement between union and employer that settles a dispute. Measured against the initial objectives of campaigners or the initial demands of a union, the parliamentary bill and the negotiated settlement rarely provide their instigators with a full settlement of all their original demands. To turn this commonplace observation about pluralistic politics into a supposedly devastating refutation of reformism in parliamentary politics is mere foolishness. The relevance of popular struggle highlights a different problem and a substantial contradiction within Trotskyist political thinking, touching on the conclusions to be drawn from the achievements of reforms. Trotsky himself promoted the idea of transitional demands, claims that reflected workers' interests but whose impossibility of achievement supposedly leads workers to pronounce a death sentence on the capitalist system, quote, "let it perish," end quote. Trotsky, 1938. But if workers and their allies can satisfy demands under capitalism, partially or entirely, whether it be a wage rise, the cancellation of a tax hike, or the relaxation of abortion restrictions, why should they reach any revolutionary conclusions at all? Surely the experience of victorious victories demonstrates the value and effectiveness of their existing, quote, repertoire of collective action, end quote, within the political and economic parameters of the capitalist system. In response to this conundrum, Trotskyists have what they, quote, parenthesis, wrongly, end parenthesis, believe to be a plausible answer, which turns on the consciousness-raising effects of participation in class struggle. See below. Party and electoral programs. We demand everything. If, quote, reformism, end quote, has indeed, quote, failed, end quote, or is no longer relevant, and the world's problems can be solved only through socialist revolution, then it is hardly surprising that the electoral programs of Trotskyist parties have typically offered exceptionally ambitious programs comprising a mixture of so-called, quote, minimum and, quote, maximum demands. In traditional parlance, minimum demands are probably achievable under capitalism, and examples would include an increase in the national minimum wage, the removal of private firms from national public health care systems, and the abolition of education fees. Maximum demands represent the full program of socialism and include calls for extensive nationalization of private companies in such fields as energy, finance, construction, and land, an end to racism and the creation of a socialist United States of Europe in the place of the European Union. Occasionally, the more orthodox or radical Trotskyist groups throw in a few, quote, transitional, end quote, demands, such as a, quote, sliding scale of wages, end quote, to protect earnings against inflation, or, quote, employment for all, end quote, e.g. League of the Fifth International 2021. See also the FTCI 2021. According to Trotsky, these proposals would supersede traditional minimum demands and assist in worker mobilization against capitalism. Taken together, the various sets of minimum and maximum demands set out in Trotskyist electoral programs and manifestos. Taken together, the various sets of minimum and maximum demands set out in Trotskyist electoral programs and manifestos have an overwhelming air of utopianism, as if a vote for the Socialist Workers' Party in the USA or the Socialist Party in Britain will help fix every conceivable problem that has blighted people's lives. See, for example, the election manifestos of the Socialist Party 2015 and the WRP 2019 in Britain, the American Socialist Workers' Party 2020 program for the presidential election, the extensive list of demands from the Socialist Alternative 2021 and the League for the Fifth International 2021, and the COVID emergency program issued by the minuscule British-based International Socialist League 2021. Trotskyists may object that their programs and demands seem ultra-radical only in comparison to the feeble offerings of tired social democratic parties. But over the past 40 years, voters looking for credible alternatives to social democracy have turned to the more realistic plans of Greens and radical left parties and turned their backs on wildly ambitious and unrealistic programs of tiny Trotskyist groups. New section. Parliamentary elections decide nothing. Let me get some water real quick. The idea that the, quote, reformist era, end quote, has now ended is typically reinforced by equally groundless claims about parliamentary politics and elections. Almost all Trotskyist groups have been content to recycle Lenin's 1917 remark on Parliament, quoted earlier, as if they were the last word on the subject, and which it would be foolish or impossible to revise. Quote, "It is necessary to struggle against the illusion of so-called, quote, democratic capitalism, end quote, among workers and youth, end quote, LIS 2020. Quote, all reformist proposals, fall short of overthrowing capitalism in bourgeois regimes, end quote, LITCI 2020. Freedom cannot come from a parliamentary majority delivering change, Chunara and Kimber, 2011, British Socialist Workers' Party. See also Lutte Ouvrière, 2017-2021. Lenin's claim, lifted from Marx in 1871, is that Parliament was an integral component of the capitalist state, an institution which necessarily served bourgeois class interests. At its core are, quote, special bodies of armed men, end quote. But its vast apparatus also includes legislative, executive, judicial, and administrative branches. Marx and Lenin suggested at different times that the state, including the government, acted either at the behest of capital or on behalf of capitalist interests. For a more sophisticated Marxist account of the state, see Jessup, 1990. It's Bob Jessup. Policies which were contrary to the interests of capital were therefore impermissible and would either be obstructed, diluted, or rejected. The role of parliamentary elections was simply to determine which bourgeois party would rule. The role of any revolutionary deputies was to employ the legislature of as a rostrum from which to deliver socialist propaganda. Should a truly radical government ever be elected, then the ruling class would simply overthrow it in a military coup, as in Chile in 1973 and in a host of other Latin American countries throughout the 20th century. Marx's remarks were written at a time when the socialist movement, centered on the political party, was in its infancy, and its sole representative being the German Social Democratic Party, Sozialistische Demokratische Partei Deutschlands. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but whatever. By the time of his death in 1883, there were socialist or social democratic parties. The terms were then used interchangeably in 8 European countries, and by the time of Engels' death in 1895, there were socialist parties in 19 countries, including Argentina, Brazil, and the USA. Electoral progress followed slowly but steadily, assisted by general strikes and protests to expand the suffrage, as in Belgium, 1893, so that by the years immediately prior to World War I, the most successful socialist parties were securing approximately one-third of the popular vote. Sweden, 36.4%, 1914, Germany, 34.8%, 1912, and Belgium, 30.3%, 1914. See Sassoon, 1996. 30 years later, in the immediate post-World War II elections, social democratic vote shares rose in some countries above 40%. Sorry, I'm sitting behind a bush, and one of the branches keeps hitting me in the back of the head. And I'll move up a bit. Sorry about that. There we are. 30 years later, in the immediate post-World War II elections, social democratic vote shares rose in some countries above 40%. Austria, Norway, Sweden, and the UK, whilst the communist vote shares in the same period were close to or even exceeded 20% in Finland. in Finland, France, and Italy, for example. See Sassoon, 1996. To dismiss parliamentary elections during the 19th century, when a tiny electorate chose between a variety of conservative and liberal parties, was reasonable enough. To maintain such a dismissive attitude, despite the rising vote share and electoral success of left-wing parties around the world, is an unerring sign of dogmatism. Such dogmatism was indeed widespread amongst the revolutionary left in one European country in modern times, where many Trotskyists believed there was a real prospect of socialist revolution, namely Portugal 1974-75. Although the country's two Trotskyist parties actually participated in the 1975 Constituent Assembly election, much of the far left called for a boycott, yet they were comprehensively rebuffed. Quote, despite the urging by the MFA, Armed Forces Movement, to spoil the ballots, and the CRTM's Revolutionary Council of Workers, Soldiers, and Tailors conference in the weekend before, telling people that real democracy lay in Portuguese Soviets, 91.73% of the electorate voted, end quote. Varela. Electoral success is epitomized in the radical left parties that came to power in many countries in the first decades of the 21st century. See Charlumbus 2022 and March 2011. I don't know if that's March is the last name or it's referring to the month. I don't know. In Europe, Syriza governed Greece from January 2015 to July 2019, and shortly afterward, Podemos joined a coalition government with the Spanish SPWP. During the same period, 2015 to 19, Bloco Esquerda gave critical support to the socialist government in Portugal. Some years earlier, Latin America had witnessed the rise of left parties, variously described as radical left, populist left, or social democratic, which eventually came to power in 4 countries. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez was elected president in 1998 as his Fifth Republic movement. Later, the Partido Socialista Unido de Venezuela, PSUV, swept to power, promising radical reforms that would raise living standards and reduce inequalities. In Brazil, the Workers' Party was in government between 2003 and 2016, and its leading figure, Luis Lula da Silva, served as president between 2003 and 2010. In the wake of Chavez's success, 2 similar parties came to power elsewhere. The Movimiento al Socialismo in neighboring Bolivia won the 2005 election under the leadership of Evo Morales, and the following year, Rafael Correa's Alianza, PAIS, won the general election and the presidency in Ecuador. Despite a variety of problems, including attempted coups in Bolivia and Venezuela, the record of some of these governments is impressive. In Brazil, for example, collective agreements repeatedly secured above-inflation wage settlements, and the numbers living in poverty fell dramatically between 2003 and 2013. In contrast, Syriza reneged on its promise to reject EU-imposed austerity, disillusioning its more left-wing members and creating a party split in 2015. More recently, all of these parties have experienced setbacks of one kind or another, with the starkest examples being the rapid collapse of the Venezuelan economy and the electoral defeat of Syriza in 2019. Oh, shit. Some sections of the world Trotskyism have been fairly nuanced in their appraisals of the, quote, radical left parties, or what are sometimes called, quote, broad left parties, end quote, notably the CWI, International Socialist Alternative, ISA, the United Secretariat of the Fourth International, USFI. In contrast, many other internationals have responded to the setbacks and problems of these parties with an orgy of schadenfreude, gleefully poring over the failures, setbacks, and mistakes of Dilinka, Podemos, Syriza, and the Workers' Party of Brazil, staunchly declaring that everything has turned out exactly as they predicted. There is no parliamentary road to socialism, they say, and its failures in these countries amply confirm the words of Trotsky in the transitional program. The priority for workers is to build independent, revolutionary, democratic, centralist parties and seize power, e.g.,
the CORQI 2017, the FTCI 2013, IMT 2020, LIS 2018, LITCI 2018, Poros and Sorans 2018. For example, when British Labour narrowly held onto the northern parliamentary seat of Batley and Spen in July 2021 with 13,296 votes, 35.3% vote share, Trotskyist commentators were quick to find fault. Quote, Labour holds on, but the crisis remains, end quote, Socialist Workers' Party. Quote, another condemnation of Starmer's New Labour, end quote, Socialist Party. Quote, the party is heading for disaster, end quote, Socialist Appeal. The comments are breathtakingly hypocritical. If a Trotskyist candidate were to obtain even 10% of Labour's results, its 1,330 votes would be hailed as a fabulous result and a major advance for Trotskyist politics. Whilst the dismissal of parliamentary elections and election results is foolish, it does nonetheless play an important role in Trotskyist discourse. Since Trotskyist election results almost always and everywhere have been desperately poor, it is wonderfully consoling to observe that they basically don't matter because Trotskyists will come to power through a, quote, violent insurrection, that destroys the bourgeois state, end quote, and not through electoral successes within the state. See FTCI 2013. New section. Failure to grasp the relationship between class struggle and class consciousness. Trotskyists frequently contrast the dead hand and the dead end of parliamentary politics with the radical and invigorating effects of direct political action. It was Karl Marx who first identified a possible link between class struggle and class consciousness in brief remarks towards the end of his 1847 book, The Poverty of Philosophy. Quote, the combination of capital has created for this mass a common situation, common interests. This mass is thus already a class as against capital, but not yet for itself. In the struggle of which we have noted only a few phases, this mass becomes united and constitutes itself as a class for itself. End quote. Marx. Lenin radically revised this judgment, declaring in 1902, quote, the history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by the working class's own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, i.e. conviction that it is necessary to combine in unions, fight the employers, and strive to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation, etc. End quote. Lenin. The transformation of these views into revolutionary class consciousness required the intervention of the Revolutionary Party to explain the links between local and national struggles and between labor exploitation and other forms of oppression. Writing in 2007, the Socialist Workers' Party's Chris Harman largely repeated Marx's own words, quote, it is only when those whose labor keeps capitalism going are engaging in fighting aspects of the system that they discover they have the power to paralyze it. Only then do large numbers begin to see clearly that their interests run in opposite directions to those of the capitalists. They discover through struggle that they can challenge the system, and that as a class they have an interest in uniting to replace profit-making and competition with a society of democratic self-organization. It is through the struggle that people discover they have the collective capacity to change society, end quote. Chris Harman, 2007. Similar refrains have been issued by the Socialist Party leader Hannes Sell, by the IMT and the ISA and the Fraction Trotskyista. Quote, on the basis of their experience and struggle, fresh layers of the working class, trade unionists, community campaigners, and young people are drawing the conclusion that they need their own political voice, end quote. Sell. Hannah Sell, 2006. Quote, in the first instance, the workers' mobilizations will have a predominantly economic character, but in the process they will become radicalized because of the depth of the crisis and the enormous frustrations that have accumulated over the years, eventually taking on a political character. A new May 68 or hot autumn will be on the order of the day in one country after another. End quote. IMT 2020. Quote, this crisis is creating monumental calamities for the masses and paving the way for even bigger calamities in the future, but it is also paving the way for huge changes in consciousness of tens of millions of workers and young people the world over. end quote, ISA 2021. Quote, the connection between class struggle and the political radicalization of vanguard sectors is fertile ground for the emergence of revolutionary parties, revitalizing the ideas of revolutionary Marxism, end quote. FTCI 2021. These processes of radicalization will all be facilitated, according to these writers and their organizations, through the role of the Leninist Vanguard Party in helping transform the rudimentary and radical ideas and beliefs engendered by class struggles into fully developed forms of revolutionary class consciousness. Since the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution, there have been literally thousands of strikes every year in many different countries, not to mention numerous protests and demonstrations by a wide range of civil society organizations campaigning around specific group oppressions, women, gays, ethnic minorities, etc., or specific issues, wars, colonialism, housing, the environment. If participation in struggle is the key driver of a qualitative development in class consciousness, that will lead people into revolutionary politics, in this case Trotskyism, then how are we to explain the absolutely minuscule membership and influence of the World Trotskyist movement noted in previous chapters? 1 second. Do the implications of action for consciousness depend on the nature of the demands, the scale of action, the nature of the opponent, the outcome of the action? The Trotskyist literature has barely addressed these and other analytical questions. Kalinikos 1987 is a rare exception, and its programmatic and perspective documents are content for the most part with indolent repetitions of Marx and Lenin. One early attempt to think about this issue was Mandel's 1977 essay on Lenin's theory of organization, in which he argued that class consciousness developed in different ways between ordinary workers, crudely referred to as the, quote, masses, end quote, activists, or what he called, quote, advanced workers, end quote, and party members, the, quote, revolutionary nuclei, end quote. But the categories in his article, action, experience, and consciousness, remain so hopelessly vague and ill-defined as to be of no analytical value whatever. A more recent attempt was made in a collection called Marxism and Social Movements, but although one of the editors rightly described Marx's 1847, quote, class in itself, end quote, as a, quote, nomic phrase, end quote, neither he nor any of his contributors offered any useful way of transcending its limitations and thinking analytically about the dynamics of class consciousness. The social movement's literature, the dynamics of class consciousness. See Barker et al. 2014. See also Barker 2021. The socialist movement literature does, however, provide a wealth of concepts for thinking about the enigma of class struggle effects on class consciousness, notwithstanding the criticisms in Barker et al. 2014. See, for instance, Snow et al. 2019, Taro 2011, Tilley 1978. This large and diverse literature has argued that social movement actions can vary along any or all the following dimensions, and that these attributes are interrelated in complex and contingent ways. Motives for participation in action, often categorized as ideological, social, or instrumental. Demands, nature of the demands, defensive or offensive, singular or plural, forms of action, peaceful or violent, sporadic or sustained. Scale of protest, small to large, e.g. single company strike through to a general strike. Nature of the protagonist, single group to broad coalition. Cohesion of protagonists, high degree of unity through to division and disunity. Cohesion of opponents, high degree of unity through to divisions and disunity. Opponent strategies, negotiation, contestation, or repression. Political opportunity structures, extent and nature of channels through which demands can be progressed. Outcome, win, compromise, defeat. Outcomes, win, compromise, defeat. It is apparent from this list that the basic Trotskyist model, collective action plus the Revolutionary Party equal a rise in revolutionary class consciousness, is extremely simplistic and provides further evidence of the debilitating effects of doctrinaire attachment to Marxist and Trotskyist ideas. New section. The conflation of protest, rebellion, and revolution. The failure to engage with the social movement's literature is both cause and effect of the widespread conflation of different forms of collective action. The periodic Trotskyist appraisals of global capitalism, often labeled, quote, perspectives documents, end quote, typically lump together myriad and disparate forms of collective action, including demonstrations, strikes, rebellions, and insurgencies, seemingly oblivious of their different dynamics. Quote, the approach of social revolution has already been foreshadowed in the mass demonstrations and strikes that swept across the globe in 2019 in Mexico, Puerto Rico, Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, France, Spain, Algeria, Britain, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Sudan, Kenya, South Africa, India, and Hong Kong, end quote. IACFI 2020. Quote, the outburst of the masses in Belarus against Lukashenko's regime, the unprecedented revolts of the youth in Thailand and Nigeria, the large summer strike wave in Iran, the revival of mass protests in Lebanon and Chile, the general strikes in South Africa and Indonesia, all have confirmed the generalized discontent and explosive potential of this period as the revolutionary process develops. End quote. ISA 2021. Quote, let us just recall the events of the past 12 months. Revolutionary upheavals broke out in France, Catalonia, Iran, Sudan, Algeria, Tunisia, Hong Kong, Ecuador, Chile, Haiti, Iraq, and Lebanon, where the masses took to the streets and general strikes paralyzed the countries. In Venezuela, we had the defeat of the determined counter-revolutionary coup backed by U.S. imperialism, end quote. IMT 2020, and for other similar statements, see CW 2021, 4th International Executive Bureau 2020, 4th International Lambertist 2016, FTCI 2021, IMT 2021, LITCI 2019. It seems that many mass protests elsewhere in the world are always a potential, quote, harbinger, end quote, of a, quote, revolutionary upheaval, end quote, because they appear to meet two of Lenin's three criteria for revolution. The masses, quote, realize the impossibility of living in the old way, end quote, and the ruling class, quote, should not be able to live and rule in the old way, end quote. The presence of a mass revolutionary party is the third condition. Lenin, 1920. Detailed accounts of protests and demonstrations in particular countries can be found on the websites of every single Trotskyist international and every major national organization. For the most part, these are descriptive journalistic essays, often containing an abundance of useful information about key points. What is the issue or issues that has triggered the protest? To what extent do the immediate demands of the protest, e.g., rescinding of tax rises, Colombia, or cancellation of transport price rises, Chile, flow from long-standing and deeper demands about issues such as living standards, inequality, party political corruption, and police violence? How readily can the governing parties meet some or all of the protesters' demands, for example, by offering concessions, ministerial resignations, or fresh elections? Which are the main groups involved in the protest, and which groups are underrepresented? Lazy descriptions of the, quote, masses, end quote, are completely unhelpful. To what extent are there serious divisions within the ruling class over the issues in dispute? In other words, protests and demonstrations can be viewed through a number of theoretical lenses as a civil society contestation of the state, a power struggle between different social forces, a negotiation between competing groups. In contrast, and despite detailed empirical accounts of protests, the Trotskyist lens, with its focus on an enduring escalation of class consciousness and the growth of the revolutionary party and a revolutionary situation, is almost invariably fanciful and unhelpful. Moreover, since many of the countries referenced at the start of this section are liberal democracies, it is worth recalling Goodwin's observation in the closing pages of his classic study of revolutions that, quote, no popular revolutionary movement, it bears emphasizing, has ever thrown a consolidated democratic regime, end quote. Goodwin. This fact links back to the point made earlier about popular support for the institutions of parliamentary democracy and the widespread reluctance of the, quote, masses, end quote, to overthrow these institutions and leap into the dark with Soviets or workers' councils under the influence or tutelage of one of the many Trotskyist parties jockeying for power. New section. Quote, if only there had been a mass revolutionary party, end quote. Lamentation replaces analysis. In the late 1980s, Colin Barker, then a leading member of the British Socialist Workers' Party, edited a study of the 5 recent revolutionary events from 3 continents: France 1968, Chile 1972-73, Portugal 1974-75, Iran 1979, and Poland 1980-81. Barker. None of these cases culminated in a social revolution, a revolutionary seizure of power involving the remaking of political institutions and social relations of production. According to the editors, the main explanation for these repeated failures can be expressed very simply. Quote, "In no case did a significant revolutionary party offer an alternative path to that taken. In our view, that missing element played a major part in the destruction of these movements," end quote. Colin Barker. Over 30 years later, Chunara, 2020, concluded his review of the 21st century cycles of revolt with a similar observation, reiterating the need for, quote, "mass revolutionary socialist organizations with genuine roots in the working class," end quote. And for a similar point from the same tradition, see Harman 2007 and Molyneux 2019. From a different tradition, Socialist Party leader Peter Taaffe offered the following explanation for the absence of 21st century revolutions following protests in Africa, Europe, and the USA. Quote, "They failed because of the absence of the one ingredient that was present and vital for the success of the Russian Revolution, a mass Marxist party with a far-sighted leadership basing itself on the movement of the working class and able to lead it to power," end quote. Taaffe, 2017. In similar vein, IMT leader Alan Woods recently attributed the lack of contemporary revolutions in Europe to the absence of the, quote, "subjective factor," end quote, a mass revolutionary Bolshevik-style party. See 2022 and see also Red Flag 2019. The same themes occur in the analysis of contemporary protests by other internationals, both in Europe and Latin America. Quote, "As Marx once explained, though, people make their own history not under circumstances of their own choosing, but under circumstances transmitted from the past. This includes the continuing absence on a world scale of mass left parties with credibility and roots among significant layers of the working class," end quote. ISA. Quote, "In this period, accelerating the building of revolutionary Marxist organizations and strengthening and consolidating the existing organizations will be of historical importance," end quote. LIS 2020. Quote, "Among the weakness of these revolutions, bracket, in North Africa, end bracket, the main one is the absence of a revolutionary party rooted in workplaces and poor neighborhoods," end quote. LITCI 2020. The most striking feature of these and many other articles is their analytical poverty. Some are content to repeat the same platitudes about the influence of Stalinist and social democratic parties that have been the hallmark of Trotskyist literature for 70 years, but fail to ask the obvious question: why have Trotskyist groups repeatedly failed to loosen the grip of these parties on working class constituencies? If it is only Trotskyist programs and policies that correspond to the real interests of the working class and their allies, then why have workers failed to register these facts and switch their allegiance? Trotskyists rarely ask these questions, perhaps because they lack any theoretical framework for posing and investigating them, and perhaps too because they fear the unpalatability of the most likely answers. Consequently, the issue of the, quote, "revolutionary party," end quote, is routinely displaced from the realm of theorizing and analysis, only to reappear as the object of pure speculation in a shallow counterfactual history. Quote, "If only there had been a mass revolutionary party," end quote, in Chile, Ecuador, Libya, Sudan, etc., when the outcome might well have turned out quite differently and ushered in a genuine workers' revolution, or a rerun of October 1917. As always with counterfactual history, it is extremely difficult to judge the plausibility of the alternative narrative on offer. What can be said with certainty is that the counterfactual claim is offered in the absence of any theory about the conditions under which some or all of a set of Trotskyist parties could develop mass support, displace their political rivals, and launch a revolutionary seizure of power. In the absence of any analysis of party failure, lamentations step into the breach, constituting yet another element in the picture of Trotskyist doctrinarism and intellectual poverty. New section. Let's build a new mass anti-capitalist workers' party. Several branches of the Trotskyist movement rejected the idea that the fall of the Stalinist regimes between 1989 and 1992 signaled the potential resurgence of Trotskyism, arguing instead that, quote, these events, 1989 to 1992, represent a major defeat for the workers' movement internationally, end quote. See TAF, the Socialist Workers' Party person, 2004. In a similar vein, the mainstream Fourth International, USFI, declared in 1991 that, quote, the overthrow of the dictatorships, bracket, in Eastern Europe and the USSR, end bracket, is a victory of the oppressed, but the affirmation of trends towards capitalist restoration is a defeat for the historic interest of the exploited, end quote. Said in Livio Metan, 2019. Both the CWI, led by TAF and the others, and the USFI concluded that the construction of the Revolutionary Vanguard Party would have to proceed indirectly, and in 1995 the USFI took the unprecedented step of calling for the construction of new, broad-left parties that would aim to transcend the limitations and small size of the typical Trotskyist Vanguard Party by acting as a, quote, pole of left regroupment, end quote. Ben Said et al., 2011, Fourth International, 2010, 2018. Exemplars of this new policy came to be known as, quote, radical left parties, end quote, and took a variety of forms in different countries, splits from communist parties, e.g. Rifondazione Comunista in Italy, from social democratic parties, PSOL in Brazil, a breakaway from the Workers' Party, and mergers of various left and green parties, e.g. Syriza in Greece, Bloco de Esquerda in Portugal. See Videt, or Vide, 2011, VIDET. The CWI supported an ostensibly similar policy with its 1995 call for a, quote, new mass workers' party, end quote, as the British Labour Party shifted to the right under new leader Tony Blair. Quote, working class people need a party that can organize a fight back. The Labour Party cannot play that role. A new socialist party has to be formed, end quote. TAF. The call for a new workers' party remains the perspective of the CWI and indeed of its main breakaway international organization, the ISA. The rest of the international Trotskyist movement has repeatedly condemned this policy, maintaining its adherence to the model of the Leninist Vanguard Party that would seize power through an armed revolution, and gleefully noting the electoral and policy failings of parties such as Syriza and Podemos. See CORQI 2017, LIS 2020, LITCI 2019. Yet despite many years of assiduous activity inside radical left parties, Trotskyist groups have achieved remarkably little, either in terms of membership or influence. There is no evidence that the policies and programs of parties such as Syriza, Podemos, Die Linke, and Rifondazione Comunista are any more left-wing now than 10 or 15 years ago as a result of Trotskyist factional agitation. Nor is there any evidence of significant gains in membership or public support as a result of this interest activity. For example, 3 Italian Trotskyist groups withdrew from Rifondazione Comunista in 2007 following its decision to join the center-left government of Romano Prodi. The 3 organizations, Partito Comunista dei Lavoratori, Communist Workers' Party, Partito di Alternativa Comunista, Communist Alternative Party, and Sinistra Critica, Critical Left, then contested the elections of 2008, 2013, and 2018 as independent organizations, but none of them achieved a vote share greater than 0.6%. What is also striking about the entry of Trotskyist groups into radical left parties is that despite an ostensibly shared goal, building Trotskyist influence inside the host organization, the divisions between them have persisted. For example, there are 3 Trotskyist factions inside Die Linke and 3 in the Workers' Party of Brazil. Without doubt, the most extraordinary organization is the PSOL in Brazil, which currently, April 2022, has an astonishing 9 Trotskyist factions, each beavering away, trying to enhance its influence at the expense of its heretical rivals. In short, the, quote, mass workers' party, end quote, route to Trotskyist influence has proved to be as ineffective as the more traditional route of building an independent Leninist vanguard party. New section. The specters of Lenin and Stalin, or the unattractiveness of Bolshevism. Trotsky's publications marking the centenary of the Russian Revolution almost invariably took the form of panegyrics and eulogies, offering not a word of criticism of the most controversial Bolshevik decisions taken and defended by Lenin and Trotsky, the dispersal of the democratically elected Constituent Assembly, which was criticized by Rosa Luxemburg, the provision of sweeping powers of arrest, trial, and execution to the secret police, the Cheka, the eventual banning of every other political party, the ban on inter-party factions, and the brutal suppression of the Kronstadt Rebellion with its call for multi-party democracy. See, for example, Faulkner, 2017, Sewell, 2017, Sherry, 2017, linked to the USFI, IMT, and Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, respectively. Only Mandel, 2016, leader of the mainstream Fourth International. He wasn't alive then, was he? He died in the 90s. So that's probably... I don't know, maybe this is an error in the book, saying that Mandel said something in 2016 about the centennial of the Bolshevik Revolution, because Mandel died in 1995. Only Mandel, 2000... I'll just read what it says. Maybe it's a different Mandel. Only Mandel, 2016, leader of the mainstream Fourth International, suggested that some of these measures were bad strategic choices, reflecting crude and untenable theories of political democracy and party organization. Years after the consolidation of the Stalinist regime, Trotsky eventually suggested that multiple parties might exist in the Soviet Union. But the value of this apparent concession was seriously undermined by his two caveats. Only pro-Soviet parties should be legalized, whilst all, quote, non-Soviet, end quote, parties would remain illegal, and even those decisions would be made by a vote of the, quote, workers and peasants, end quote. The Stalinist model of an authoritarian one-party state with centralized economic planning and near-universal public ownership, what Trotsky described as a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, was replicated across Eastern Europe by the advancing Red Army in 1945-46 and later spread to the communist states of Southeast Asia and to Cuba. Those Trotskyists continued to provide what they called, quote, critical support, end quote, to the Soviet Union and to these, quote, deformed worker states, end quote, created in its likeness across the world, the only exception being the, quote, third camp, end quote, Trotskyists such as Tony Cliff and his followers, who declared these countries to be, quote, state capitalist, end quote, regimes that had nothing to do with socialism. In recent years, however, some Trotskyist groups have transitioned from, quote, critical, end quote, to uncritical support of particular authoritarian one-party, quote, socialist, end quote, states. The American Socialist Workers' Party and its tiny satellite parties, including the Communist League in Britain, have become uncritical admirers of Cuba, whilst the UK-based Socialist Action have become an equally uncritical admirer of China. All Trotskyists, however, have been keen to emphasize that the early Soviet regime built by Lenin and Trotsky between 1917 and circa 1922 is fundamentally different from the Stalinist regime, and the statement made by Socialist Appeal and IMT leader Alan Woods is typical, quote, by the democratic workers' state established by Lenin and Trotsky in 1917, quote, but the democratic workers' state established by Lenin and Trotsky in 1917 had absolutely nothing in common with the bureaucratic totalitarian monstrosity presided over by Stalin and his successors, end quote. It's the most ideological shit I've ever heard. But if you're in for like a depressing talk, there's a debate between Orlando Figgis, who's like kind of just like a slightly left liberal. I think he referred to himself as a Tony Blair man, and Alan Woods about the nature of the Bolshevik Revolution. It's embarrassing. It's sad. You're just listening the whole time. It's like, I don't agree with any of these people's perspectives. But at least Orlando Figgis doesn't seem to get down to outright lying. The Stalin regime was clearly monstrous, barbaric. So back to the text. The Stalin regime was clearly monstrous, barbaric, and violent, but the idea that none of its attributes, Bolshevik party control of the state, absence of legal opposition, etc., was prefigured in any way at all through the authoritarianism of Lenin and Trotsky is wholly unconvincing. It is, however, quite typical of the Manichaean worldview that has characterized the Trotskyist movement from the Trotskyist movement's inception, and which continues to this day, a worldview marked by wholly uncritical adulation of Lenin and Trotsky. Consequently, Trotskyist manifestos and programs printed and distributed in scores of parliamentary democracies around the world almost invariably declare that the road to socialism lies through an armed revolution that will overthrow the state, abolish parliamentary democracy, and replace it with the, quote, higher, end quote, democracy of Soviets and workers' councils. When we considered that almost every successful revolution has been preceded, accompanied, or followed by a civil war, Russia, China, Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, etc., it is easy to appreciate why the Trotskyist, quote, offer, end quote, has been universally rejected whenever people have experienced electoral contests between a variety of political parties in liberal democracies. Adherence to the, quote, state capitalist analysis, end quote, of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European Stalinist states have neatly avoided the tricky problem of defending authoritarian one-party states as the embodiment of socialist values, and hence their famous Korean War slogan, quote, neither Washington nor Moscow, end quote. But their escape from one political and intellectual trap merely opens up another, because it obliges them to defend the policy of socialist revolution when, by their own admission, every socialist revolution in the world has proved to be a disastrous failure. Why should, quote, their, end quote, revolution be any different? New section. Orthodox and radical Trotskyism, ideological certitude, electoral delusion, and millenarian fantasy. Circling around the larger Trotskyist internationals, the USFI, the IMT, LITCI, etc., is a collection of minuscule and sectarian bodies, each explicitly declaring itself to be the sole guardian of Trotskyist orthodoxy, as embodied inter alia in the founding document of the Fourth International, the 1938 transitional program with its bold closing lines, quote, the advanced workers united in the Fourth International show their class the way out of the crisis, ... The banner of the Fourth International, ... is the banner of your approaching victory, end quote, Trotsky, 1938. Orthodox Trotskyism emerged from the 1953 split in the world movement led by the British Socialist Labour League, the French Parti Communiste Internationaliste, and the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party. After the American Socialist Workers' Party rejoined the mainstream Fourth International in 1963, an orthodox faction split off from the party, eventually creating Spartacist leagues in various countries under the leadership of a new body, the International Communist League, Fourth Internationalist, ICL-FI. By the late 1970s, there were three Orthodox internationals led by British, French, and U.S. parties, respectively, but splits over the ensuing years meant that by 2022, there are now 7 bodies, each claiming to be the sole adherents of Orthodox Trotskyism. Exclusivity and certitude are the hallmarks of these tiny and irrelevant organizations. The International Committee of the Fourth International, ICFI, was initially founded in 1953, but reemerged from the implosion of the WRP in 1985 under the leadership of the American activist David North, an immodest and arrogant individual. I'm going to say that is a very apt description of that guy. If you ever hear him talk, it's unbelievable. One of the things that he fucking said one time, I was remember hearing this guy, maybe I'm making this up, maybe this is just a fever dream of mine, but he was like applauding the Trotsky for like teaching the workers that not to swear. teaching the workers couth. Maybe I'm full of shit, but I swear to God I heard that. Anyway, let me repeat that sentence. The International Committee of the Fourth International, ICFI, was initially founded in 1953, but reemerged from the implosion of the WRP in 1985 under the leadership of the American activist David North, an immodest and arrogant individual. For North and his colleagues, there is only one current of Marxism. Quote, Trotskyism is Marxism of the 21st century, end quote. And within the Trotskyist universe, there is only one genuine Trotskyist party. Quote, Theoretically and in practice, the UCFI has established that it is the sole revolutionary political party of the international working class and the sole representative of genuine Marxism. There is not a political tendency in the world outside of the ICFI that can plausibly claim to represent the continuity of the international party founded by Trotsky in 1938, end quote. Unsurprisingly, similar claims have been made by several other Trotskyist groups. According to Jack Barnes, veteran leader of the American Socialist Workers' Party, quote, "The Socialist Workers' Party is the only party in the U.S. whose continuity as communist is unbroken," end quote. See Evans and Studer, 2019. 20 years earlier, the Spartacist International Communist League had issued an almost identical statement, quote, "The ICL is the only international organization which presently has a correct general conception of the world situation and of the tasks facing the world proletariat," end quote. ICL, FI, 1998. Not to be outdone in the competition for grandiosity and certitude, the League for the Fifth International, represented in Britain by the 30 or so members of Workers' Power, has repeatedly claimed that none of the existing Fourth Internationals is truly revolutionary, and that the world therefore needs a new Fifth International, of which it happens to be the sole and principal custodian. League of the Fifth International, 2010, Workers' Power and Irish Workers' Group, 1983. See also the Collectif Révolution Permanente. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Tiny, even by the low standards of Trotskyism, for an equally dismissive view of every other Trotskyist group on the planet. Yeah, that's an old critique, right? Every Leninist wants to be Lenin. Every Leninist party wants to be the Leninist party. The questions like, yeah, if you establish this party dictatorship, what are you going to do about all of the other so-called revolutionary parties that are trying to achieve the same position of power that you are? Perhaps the most bizarre manifestation of orthodoxy is to be found in the continued offer of, quote, critical support, end quote, a la Trotsky for the, quote, deformed worker states, end quote, a category that includes the repressive one-party authoritarian regimes of China, Vietnam, and Laos, as well as the monstrous tyranny of North Korea, the first country in the world to create a hereditary communist ruling caste. The Orthodox ICFI, the near moribund Spartacist ICL-FI, the IBT, and the League for the Fourth International all take this view, as do the radical Trotskyists of the League for the Fifth International and the revolutionary communist tendency. This position is rooted in their understanding of world imperialism as the principal obstacle to revolutionary progress. Any organization or state that is an enemy of the main imperialist power, the USA, is therefore deserving of, quote, critical support, end quote. In more common parlance, quote, my enemy's enemy is my friend, end quote. For both Orthodox and radical Trotskyists, world revolution is not a distant strategic objective, but an immediate reality. A recent headline in the Newsline, daily paper of the British WRP, boldly declared, quote, world banking crisis driving world revolution, end quote. Far from being, that's from 19th of January 2021. Far from being a serious claim grounded in analysis of the world economy and politics, this is nothing more than wishful thinking, a millenarian proposition, repeated by the WRP every year for the past 50 years. The ICFI marked the start of the third decade of the century with an equally bold and uncompromising declaration, quote, the decade of socialist revolutions begins, end quote. Hermetically sealed in their doctrinarism, inimical to genuine empirical inquiry or theoretical innovation, the organizations of Orthodox Trotskyism are condemned to repeat forever the slogans and policies of the first quarter of the 20th century, convinced that these ideas, and these alone, hold the key to their imminent transformation into mass revolutionary parties that will lead Leninist-style assaults on capitalist power around the world. Needless to say, the claims of revolutionary leadership and imminent revolution are so frequently exposed as fantasy that the guardians of orthodoxy have developed a series of rationalizations to protect their worldviews. For example, in the 2020 Sri Lankan parliamentary elections, 3 Socialist Equality Party candidates obtained just 780 votes out of a grand total of 11.6 million, a vote share of 0.0 0.07%. The ICFI's Panglossian analysis of this paltry vote total was that, quote, while these numbers are still small, they are class-conscious votes for socialism and an indication of growing support for the SEP, end quote. Ratneaka, 2020. Electoral delusion is not unique to orthodox and radical Trotskyism and occasionally appears amongst other Trotskyist families. The International Socialist League, a group of a dozen people in Liverpool, routinely contest one council ward in local elections. In 2021, when the League's aging leader, Martin Ralph, obtained his usual few hundred votes, the international Latin American parent body, the LITCI, earnestly proclaimed, quote, a great election result in Liverpool City Council, end quote, 8th of May 2021. The LITCI is no stranger to this kind of sophistry, as is clear from its assessment of the 2018 presidential election that brought Bolsonaro to power and witnessed the defeat of the ruling Workers' Party and its candidate, Fernando Haddad. The Workers' Party defeat reflected the, quote, betrayal and disappointment, end quote, amongst workers. It declared, whereas the LITCI's largest section, the Partido Socialista dos Trabajadores Unificado, PSTU, quote, carried out a politically victorious campaign, end quote, 8th of October 2018. The, quote, disappointing, end quote, Workers' Party candidate obtained a mere 33.3 votes, 29.3% of vote share, whilst the, quote, victorious, end quote, PSTU candidate came in 11th place with just 55,762 votes and a mere 0.05% of all votes cast. The year 2021 also marked the 10th anniversary of the RCIT, a tiny breakaway from the League for the Fifth International, whose membership was now reaching a few dozen in 7 countries. According to Michael Probsting, author of most of its prodigious quantity of books, pamphlets, and web content, the RCIT can look back proudly on, quote, a decade of concentrated and successful work, end quote. With a benchmark set fractionally above mere survival, it is no wonder that the prolific Probsting can delude himself about his tiny organization and seemingly bright future. Tony Jutt's remark about the British propaganda sect, the Socialist Party of Great Britain, applies with equal force to the RCIT and indeed to many other Trotskyist groups. Quote, impervious to change and too small to be adversely affected by its own irrelevance, it will presumably survive indefinitely, end quote. Tony Jutt, 2010. The Socialist Party, Great Britain, at least has the merit of putting forward good literature. I have pieces by the Socialist Party of Great Britain's Adam Buick on this channel, and I highly encourage you to check them out. However impotent they may or may not be in the face of world affairs, they at least say things that are true. Segments of the Orthodox family or of international Trotskyism have clearly been facing serious difficulties for many decades, whether it is the aging comrades of the WRP and its tiny offshoots, or the dwindling forces of the Spartacists and their tiny Fourth International. Spartacist periodicals, never frequent at the best of times, rarely published more than 2 to 3 times per year, have not appeared anywhere since mid-2020, apart from one British issue in February 2022. The British comrades apologized for the declining frequency of their thin newspaper, Workers' Hammer, from 4 issues per annum to just 2, arguing it was an inevitable result of their, quote, small and aging forces, end quote. Spartacist League, Britain, 2020. It appears that instead of being carried forward to revolutionary triumph by the laws of history, the forces of Orthodox Trotskyism are being carried into oblivion by the laws of biology. That's a diss. That could be on a diss track here. Inside Die Linke. Okay, so that's the end of the piece. Now I'm going to read the notes. Inside Die Linke are Marx 21, IST, Sozialistische Alternative, ISA, and Der Funke, IMT. The Workers' Party Brazil includes the Organização Comunista Internacional, CORQI, Democracia Socialista, USFI, and O Trabalho, Fourth International Lambertist. The 9 groups inside PSOL are Comuna Insurgencia, Movimento Esquerda Socialista, and Subverta, all USFI. Liberdade, Socialismo e Revolução. I don't know if I'm saying any of this right. Esquerda Marxista, IMT, Corrente Socialista dos Trabalhadores, UITCI, Luta Socialista, and Resistencia, neither of whom has an international affiliation. Note 2. This curious attachment to long-established Stalinist regimes does serve to align these Trotskyist organizations with the mainstream communist movement and with others such as the Cuban-loving Revolutionary Communist Group in Britain. 3. Those 7 bodies are the Bolshevik Tendency, IBT, ICFI, ICL, FI, Liaison Committee for the Fourth International, the Fourth International Lambertist, and the League for the Fourth International. In addition, there are 4 internationals that have written off almost the entire history of the Trotskyist movement and which claim they alone are the inheritors of Trotsky's own thought. These, quote, radical, end quote, organizations are the Collectif Révolution Permanente, League for the Fifth International, RCIT, and the Workers' International to rebuild the Fourth International. And note 4. Ideological certitude is not unique to Orthodox Trotskyists, but it can be found to varying degrees amongst other Trotskyist organizations. For example, in its most recent programmatic statement, the increasingly dogmatic IMT declared that, quote, we have the correct ideas, methods, and perspectives, end quote, IMT. Thanks for listening.